team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
In Oregon, beneath a layer of volcanic ash that fell more than 15,000 years ago, scientists pulled something out of the ground that was never supposed to be there. A stone tool, a scatter of animal teeth, and a date so old that the archaeologist holding it was almost too afraid to report it, because if it was real, then everything we were taught about who first set foot on this continent was wrong.
In our first 2 forays out here, we found that 15,800-year-old ash. We found camel tooth fragments.
Not slightly wrong, not off by a few centuries. Wrong in a way that could rewrite the entire story of how humans reached the Americas. And Oregon was only the beginning. The story we were taught here is what you and I were both taught, and what almost nobody around us ever thought to question. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists believed they had cracked the real mystery, the question of who actually arrived in the Americas first, thousands of years before any Europeans set sail. Their answer was a group called the Clovis people, named after a site in New Mexico where their stone tools were first uncovered. These were master hunters. They crafted fluted projectile points, spear tips with a groove running straight down the center, a design that made the weapons lighter and more lethal. According to the timeline that dominated textbooks for decades, the Clovis people walked into America roughly 13,000 years ago. They crossed a land bridge from Asia into Alaska. They pushed south through an ice-free corridor. They spread across an empty continent, clean, linear, easy to teach. There was just one problem. The ground kept disagreeing. The first crack appeared in a small rock shelter tucked into the hills of western Pennsylvania.
The rock shelter at the site contains evidence of human existence more than 19,000 years ago, and recreated villages at the site show what life was like in the 16th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
Meadowcroft Rock Shelter sat on the bank of a quiet stream, about 7 miles upriver from the Ohio. It had overhanging sandstone ledges, the kind of natural roof that one archaeologist later joked had all the comforts of a prehistoric Holiday Inn. Think about that for a second. It was exactly the sort of place a tired traveler would pick to spend the night, dry, shielded from the wind, water close at hand. For thousands of years, nobody noticed. Then, in 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller was walking the land when something caught his eye in a groundhog hole. He reached in, and his fingers closed around objects that did not belong there. Ancient-looking artifacts, pulled up by a burrowing animal from somewhere far below. Miller understood enough to know what he was holding might matter. He also understood that if word got out too soon, the site could be looted before anyone serious ever studied it. So he kept the secret for years, waiting for the right person to dig it properly. Even then, the discovery sat ignored for nearly 20 years. It took until 1973 for a scientist named Jim Adavazio to begin cutting into the floor of that shelter, one careful layer at a time, sifting through dirt that had piled up over a span no human had measured. This was not a dramatic excavation. It was slow, almost meditative work, brushes and trowels and screens, every bucket of soil sorted by hand. And the deeper Adavazio dug, the older the evidence became. Charcoal from old fires, cut stone, traces of people who had stopped here, rested, and moved on. When the radiocarbon dates came back from the labs, he stared at numbers that made no sense under the rules he had been taught. People had visited Meadowcroft as early as 16,000 to 19,000 years ago, several thousand years before the Clovis people were supposed to have set foot on the continent at all. In July 1980, Adavazio published in American Antiquity, one of the most respected journals in the field. His paper said it plainly. The Clovis first model, the theory taught to generations of students, was wrong. The response was not curiosity, it was war. Many colleagues simply refused to believe him. Some attacked the radiocarbon dates, arguing that ancient coal seams or groundwater seeping through the soil had poisoned the samples and made them look far older than they were. It was a reasonable concern on paper, and Adavazio spent years addressing it, running additional tests, answering every objection. It did not matter. Others did not argue at all. They just looked away, holding tight to the timeline they had built their careers on. Here is the thing nobody tells you about science. When a theory becomes the foundation of every paper you have published and every lecture you have given, evidence Against it does not feel like progress. It feels like an attack. The resistance got so entrenched that researchers gave it a name. They called it Clovis primacy syndrome, and they described the effort to defend it as both anachronistic and futile, a relic of an older way of thinking, a position that could not win and would not yield. It was no longer really about the data. It was about who got to decide what counted as proof, and what happened to anyone who challenged the consensus. Even now, the field is split. One survey of archaeologists found only 38% accepted Adavasio's dates. Another 38% were unsure. More than a fifth still rejected them outright. The fight largely came down to a narrow technical question about whether the earliest plant material used for dating was reliable. A debate that has dragged on for decades without a clean ending. One rock shelter in Pennsylvania, and the experts still cannot agree. But here is what should keep you up at night. If a single shelter could split an entire field for 40 years over a few thousand years, what happens when something turns up that does not nudge the timeline at all, but throws it out entirely? And what if it was already sitting in the ground, in a dry cave out west, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find it? The proof nobody expected. The next blow came from the dry caves of South Central Oregon, a place called the Paisley Caves. Scientists had known about these caves for decades. Nobody had dug deep enough or looked closely enough to ask the right question. When researchers finally did, what came out of the dirt forced the entire field to face something it had been avoiding. And I have to warn you, the evidence is not pretty. It was not a beautiful spear point or a carved tool. It was human waste, preserved feces, dried and hardened over thousands of years, left in the ground by someone who passed through long ago. It is not glamorous. The scientists handling it knew exactly how it would sound when they tried to explain it. But inside those unremarkable lumps was something stone could never give them. Human DNA. A tool tells you what someone made. It does not tell you who they were. This did. When scientists extracted mitochondrial DNA from the samples and sequenced it, the result was unmistakable. The genetic signature matched Native American founding haplogroups, the deep maternal lineages known as A2 and B2. Stop and let that sink in for a moment, because it changes everything. And while it sinks in, take 1 second to subscribe before we go further, because the cave that comes after this one is the cave that broke a man's nerve. These were not the remains of some lost population that died out and left no trace. These were not a failed migration, a group that came and vanished. These were direct ancestors of indigenous peoples living in the Americas today. Real relatives, real continuity. An unbroken line running from a cave floor in Oregon to people alive right now. And they had been at Paisley long before the Clovis people supposedly arrived. To pin the age down, the team used accelerator mass spectrometry, a method that dates the organic material itself, directly, without leaning on the soil around it. When the calibrated results came back, the fossilized waste was more than 14,000 years old. That placed these people at least 1,000 years before the accepted dates for the Clovis complex. The Clovis people were not first. They were not even close. Because here is the part that should make the hair on your arm stand up. Paisley gave the field a date and a bloodline. It did not explain how people got there, how long they had really been on the continent, or what they left behind. And about 70 miles away, in another shelter, someone was about to pull something out of the ground that he was almost too afraid to report. The date that scared a scientist. Just outside the small town of Riley in Harney County, another site was giving up its secrets slowly and stubbornly. Rimrock Draw rock shelter had been under excavation since 2011, led by University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady. Where Paisley offered DNA, Rimrock Draw offered something else. Stone tools, animal bones, and a clock written into the earth by a volcano. The clock was a band of white ash lying in the soil like a chalk line. O'Grady's team identified it as ash from a known eruption of Mount St. Helens, dated to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. The logic was simple and brutal. Anything found below that line was older than 15,000 years. Anything above it was younger. A volcano more than 1,000 miles away had stamped a date into the ground and walked away. Think of it as a receipt, baked into the earth, that nobody could forge. Below the line, the team started finding things that did not fit. They uncovered around 27 fragments of tooth enamel, tiny, easy to overlook, but enough to identify what the teeth belonged to. One came from yesterday's camel, a species that wandered the continent during the last ice age. Another matched Bison antiquus, a heavier, older ancestor of the modern buffalo. Both animals had been extinct for thousands of years, yet there they were, sealed together beneath the ash. Then came the tool. In the same layer, the team found a knife made from orange chalcedony, a kind of agate that throws back the light. Even after all those years in the dirt, it still caught the sun when O'Grady's team lifted it free. It had multiple working edges, a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, and a saw-toothed edge ground down by hard use. O'Grady later compared it to an early Swiss Army knife. The serrations were nearly smooth, polished by a hand that had used this tool again and again over a long stretch of time before it was finally left behind in the shelter. And here is what gets me. This was not something dropped on a first visit. It was a possession, something carried, relied on, worn down through a life lived long before any of our recorded history began. Where it sat changed the story. The tool was about 10 centimeters below the camel tooth fragments. In archaeology, deeper means older. So, the tool was older than the camel, and when the camel and bison remains were tested, the numbers stopped everyone cold. Multiple independent tests returned the same answer. The animals had died roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years ago, deep in the last ice age, far earlier than anyone had dared to expect. This is the moment I told you about at the start. O'Grady has been honest about how it felt. He admitted it was extremely scary to be holding a single date that old. You do not stand up in front of your field and announce something that ancient without proof to defend it. Careers have been ended over less. Reputations built across decades can collapse on one bad date. But he did not have one date. He had 2 samples, 2 separate tests, 2 identical results. The animals lived more than 18,000 years ago, and the tool buried beneath them suggested the people who made it were older still. The tools at Rimrock Draw belong to a category scientists call the Western stem tradition. Long blades, weak shoulders, rounded bases. They look nothing like Clovis points. Set the 2 side by side, and you would never guess they came from the same continent. They were shaped by different hands following different rules, almost certainly tracing back to different origins. And they predate the fluted Clovis points by thousands of years. Whoever made them was not Clovis. They were something else, something older that does not slide neatly into any of the old diagrams. And that should bother you, because it means the question was never just when, it was who. If the people at Rimrock Draw were not the ancestors of Clovis and they were here first, then somewhere out there is a story about a people we have no name for. The next time the ground spoke, it did not whisper a few thousand years. It screamed a number nobody in that field was ready to hear.
When humans first populated North America and how they arrived has long been a matter of spirited debate. The oldest known footprints in the United States is sparking new questions.
When the timeline shattered, this one came from a dry lake bed in New Mexico, and it is the closest thing to a ghost story that archaeology has. White Sands National Park is a vast field of white gypsum dunes. In 2009, researchers began finding human footprints preserved in ancient lake sediment, not 1 or 2. 61 fossilized tracks, left by people walking the shore of an Ice Age lake called Lake Otero. The prints were sharp enough to show individual toes and the curve of an arch. You can see where the foot pressed in, where it pushed off, where the mud squeezed up between someone's toes. These were not isolated steps. They were trails left by groups, including children, moving across a landscape that has long since dried into powder. And then there is the one set of prints I cannot stop thinking about. One trackway captures a single person carrying a child on one hip, walking fast across the wet ground. Every so often the prints show the child being set down, small bare feet appearing in the mud beside the adults, and then the adult's stride changing as the child is scooped back up and the journey continues. You are not looking at data here. You are looking at a parent's arms getting tired more than 20,000 years ago. A small body shifted from one side to the other. A moment so ordinary that it probably happened 1,000 times in your own childhood. That instant survived the entire history of our species pressed into mud. And it is the single most human thing anyone has ever pulled out of the deep past. Then the science has to take over again, because the date is the part that breaks everything. The first attempt to date the prints came in 2021. Scientists used radiocarbon dating on seeds from a plant called spiral ditchgrass, found in the same layers as the prints. The results came back between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That alone broke the Clovis model, but skeptics had a counter-argument, and it was the same one used against Meadowcroft decades earlier. They claimed the seeds could have absorbed carbon from groundwater, making them read as older than they truly were. You see the pattern by now. Find evidence that breaks the timeline, then question the method until the evidence goes away. So the researchers tested it again, a different way. They analyzed conifer pollen from the same layers. Pollen does not draw carbon from groundwater. It comes straight from trees that were alive when the prints were pressed into the mud. The pollen returned the same answer, 21,000 to 23,000 years. Then, in June 2025, a third study in Science Advances examined organic material from wetland mud and shallow lake sediment. 3 independent sources now: pollen, seeds, and organic mud, all pointing to the same window. The height of the last ice age, when the climate was at its most punishing, when the textbooks insist North America was empty of people entirely. The footprints lie alongside the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous animals that vanished thousands of years ago. Their paths crossing the same ground, frozen together in the record. People and megafauna walking the same shore at the same time, in a place and an era that was supposed to be lifeless. And just when you think the ground has nothing colder left to say, a road crew in California hit a bone with a backhoe. And the number that came back from that site is the one most scientists still will not repeat in public. The number they won't say out loud. The Cerutti Mastodon site was found during routine freeway construction, when workers hit bones buried deep below the surface. There was nothing ceremonial about the moment, just heavy machinery, a road project, and a backhoe operator who noticed something pale in the dirt and had the sense to stop. When paleontologists arrived, they realized they were looking at a single mastodon, an elephant-like animal that died out at the end of the Ice Age. But the bones were not simply lying where the animal fell. Something had been done to them. The bones showed spiral fractures, a distinctive break that only happens when bone is still fresh and green. Fossilized bone shatters. It does not break this way. These had been broken deliberately, the kind of damage you see when someone is working to get at the marrow inside. The breakage was not random scatter. It was focused, repeated, the work of something using force with intent. Scattered among the bones were 5 large cobbles, fist-sized stones that did not match the surrounding soil. Geologists determined the rocks were too large and too heavy to have washed there by water. Someone carried them in. Someone used them as hammerstones and anvils. The stones even showed wear and impact marks consistent with being struck against bone. Now, brace yourself, because this is the number. The bones were dated using uranium-thorium analysis, and the result held steady across every test. The remains were around 130,700 years old. Read that again. Not 13,000. 130,000. The study, published in Nature in 2017, made a claim that rattled the field to its foundation. Some kind of human. Species was present in North America at that time. Not modern humans, not Neanderthals. Something unidentified. Most of the mainstream community has chosen not to engage with Cerutti at all. It is too radical, too hard to fit into any existing frame, and admitting it might be real would mean tearing down nearly everything else. So, the question is no longer just when people arrived. It is who they were, and where on Earth they came from. For decades, the answer seemed obvious. Siberia, the land bridge, the one doorway in. But the newest evidence is pointing somewhere nobody had on the map, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The trail leads somewhere else. The old story says the first Americans walked. They crossed a land bridge called Beringia on foot, following herds across the tundra, the single way in. But the newest discoveries raise a different question. What if some of them never walked at all? What if they came by boat? Now, your first instinct is the same as mine was. Ancient people could not have crossed open ocean, except they could, and we can prove it. And the proof comes from the other side of the planet. It comes from an island in the Mediterranean called Crete. Crete has been an island for about 5 million years. It has never been connected to the mainland during the entire time humans have existed, which means anyone who ever stood on Crete arrived by boat, not a raft that drifted there by luck, a real vessel built with intent, capable of crossing open sea. Researchers led by Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou found stone tools at 2 sites on Crete, and the tools were between 130,000 and 700,000 years old, resembling those made by Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus, human ancestors who lived long before our own species existed. That is the whole point, and it is enough. If beings far older than us could build boats and cross water, then the comfortable assumption that the first Americans could only have walked is finished. One member of the team said it forced a re-examination of every assumption ever made about early human migration. So, if they did not all walk, where did the ones in the boats come from? Here is where it gets strange. Researchers studying a mitochondrial lineage called D4H traced its origin to the northern coast of China, and the lineage did not show a single clean migration into the Americas. It showed 2 separate pathways. The first wave came roughly 26,000 years ago. These people appear to have moved along the coastline, almost certainly by boat, hugging the shore from China, up past Japan, and across the rim of the Pacific. They did not cross the land bridge. They had boats, and they used them, moving camp to camp, following the food and the tides. Picture it. Small craft, families, fishing rich coastal waters, leapfrogging down a shoreline that no longer exists, because the sea rose and swallowed it when the ice melted. That is why this is so hard to find. The road they traveled is now underwater. The second wave came about 15,000 years ago. These travelers took the land route across the Bering Land Bridge. And here is the twist that turns the whole textbook inside out. They are the ones tied to the later, Clovis-era populations. The toolmakers archaeologists once crowned as the first Americans. Now, they look like something else entirely. Latecomers. People walking a path that earlier voyagers had already traveled by sea, generations before. The group we built the entire story around may have been the second act, not the first. And the stone agrees. Similar tool-making techniques show up across China, Japan, and the Americas. The same ways of working stone, the same kinds of blades and points, appearing in all 3 places, separated by an ocean. That is not coincidence. It is a trail, and it leads back across the Pacific to a story far older and stranger than the one we were handed in school. So, sit with the real question for a second. We started with one nervous scientist in an Oregon shelter, holding a date he was almost too scared to report. By the end, we are looking at footprints from the Ice Age, butchered bone older than our species, and a sea route that drowned beneath the ocean. Every single site in this story was dismissed at first. Meadowcroft was contaminated, they said. White Sands was a dating error, Cerutti was too crazy to discuss. And one by one, the tests came back and the dismissals got quieter. The pattern is impossible to ignore. The deeper anyone digs, the older the story gets, and the less the version we were taught holds together. Which leaves you and me with the question the experts still cannot answer. Was there ever a single first arrival at all? Or did people come again and again, by foot and by boat, across tens of thousands of years, from places the maps never showed, into a continent that was never the empty wilderness the textbooks drew? Tell me what you think down in the comments. A single migration out of China, or wave after wave from places we are only starting to find? I read these, and the best theories genuinely change how I look at the next site. If this rewired something for you, the next video is already loading on your screen. Hit it, drop a like on this one, and subscribe so you do not miss what we pull out of the ground next.